She had never seen a real grand piano before. The first time she did, her eyes shone like she had just found a piece of magic. It stood in the corner of her small-town library, covered with dust, the kind of instrument most people ignored because it looked too old to sing again. But to Lena, it was beautiful. Every afternoon after school she would walk there carrying a little notebook full of songs she wanted to learn. The librarian, a kind old man, would smile as he unlocked the piano lid for her. The keys were yellowed, and some didn't even make a sound anymore, but she didn't care. When she pressed them, the sound that came out was hers. Her family didn't have much. Her father fixed bicycles, and her mother worked long hours at a bakery. Their small apartment above the bakery always smelled of warm bread, but it was too noisy and cramped for a piano. The only one Lena had at home was a broken keyboard that missed more notes than it played. But when she closed her eyes, she could imagine the sound, the full, rich sound of a real piano echoing in a big hall somewhere far away. That dream started when she was just 6. Her grandmother used to hum lullabies that felt like soft piano melodies. One night, her grandmother played an old record, a concert recording of a famous pianist performing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Lena sat there frozen, staring at the player as the music filled the room. "One day," her grandmother said, smiling gently, "you'll play like that." That sentence never left her. Even after her grandmother passed away, Lena kept that record and played it every night. It was her promise, silent but strong. By the time she turned 16, Lena had learned to read sheet music on her own. There were no teachers in her town, so she borrowed books from the library and watched videos on an old laptop. Her fingers would ache after hours of practice, but she didn't stop. Every wrong note was a step closer to something right. Sometimes her classmates teased her. "You really think you'll ever play in a big concert hall?" they would say. "This is a small town, not Vienna." She would just smile and keep practicing. Words didn't hurt as much as silence, and when she played, the world finally listened. Her first real chance came when a local music competition was announced. The prize was small, but the winner would get a scholarship to a music academy in the city. That was all she needed to hear. She signed up immediately, even though she had never performed in front of an audience before. For weeks, she practiced after school until the librarian had to ask her to leave because the library was closing. She played the same piece again and again until her fingers moved like they were part of the piano itself. Her parents didn't say much, but they watched her quietly every night, proud and worried at the same time. On the day of the competition, her hands were cold and her heart raced faster than ever. She wore a simple white dress that her mother had sewn from leftover fabric. The stage was small and the piano there looked newer than anything she had ever touched. When she sat down, her legs trembled so much that she had to take a deep breath before starting. The first few notes were shaky. She almost stopped. But then she remembered her grandmother's words, the old record, and all those nights in the library. Slowly, her fear faded away and the music took over. By the time she finished, she wasn't even aware of the people watching. She only felt peace. When the applause came, she didn't believe it at first. It wasn't loud or long, but it was real. That was the first time Lena felt that maybe, just maybe, her dream wasn't foolish. A week later, she received a letter. It was from the judges of the competition. Her hands shook as she opened it. The words were short, but enough to change her life. "Congratulations, you have been selected for a scholarship at the National Academy of Music." She screamed, cried, and laughed all at once. Her parents hugged her tightly, even though they didn't fully understand what it meant. Her father said, "You'll make music that people remember." Her mother wiped her eyes and whispered, "Just don't forget where you came from." The city was like another world. Tall buildings, endless streets, and people who always seemed to be in a hurry. Lena had never seen so many lights before. When she first entered the academy, her breath caught. The marble floors, the massive concert hall, the hundreds of pianos, it felt like stepping into a dream. But that dream wasn't easy to live in. Her classmates were confident, polished, and came from wealthy families. Many of them had been playing since they were 3 years old. They talked about expensive private tutors and European competitions. Lena didn't say much. She felt like she didn't belong. During her first few weeks, she practiced quietly in the smallest rehearsal room she could find. She didn't want anyone to hear her mistakes. The walls were thin, though, and sometimes she caught fragments of others playing in nearby rooms. Their music was perfect, clean, powerful, effortless. Hers felt clumsy in comparison. There were moments when she thought about giving up. She missed home, the smell of her mother's bread, the sound of the bakery doorbell ringing. Here everything felt too fast, too shiny. No one seemed to notice her. One evening after a particularly hard day, she walked into the academy's grand hall when it was empty. The lights were dim and the air was still. At the center stood a black Steinway piano, the kind she had only seen in videos. She sat down quietly, her hands trembling. She played softly, afraid someone might walk in and tell her to stop. But in that empty hall, her music sounded different. It echoed, fuller, warmer. She felt every note travel through her, and the sadness, the hope, the longing. When she finished, she realized she was crying. She didn't know that someone had been watching. A janitor who was cleaning the upper balcony paused and listened until she was done. When she stood to leave, he clapped gently. "You play with your heart," he said with a smile. "Don't lose that no matter what happens here." Those words stayed with her. From that day, Lena decided she wouldn't compare herself to anyone else. She would play her way, the way her grandmother had taught her to feel the music, not just play it. As months passed, her confidence grew. She began to attract attention from a few professors who noticed the emotion in her performances. They said she had something rare, sincerity. Still, there were others who looked down on her. She didn't have the right background, the right clothes, or the right accent. But what she did have was a heart full of music and a determination that burned quietly. Stronger with each day. She didn't know that soon. Her path would cross with someone who would test that strength more than anyone else ever had. The semester was halfway through when Lena first heard his name. Everyone at the academy talked about him with the kind of excitement that filled the air before a storm. His name was Victor Morelli, a world-famous pianist who had played in every major concert hall in Europe. He was coming to the academy for a special master class that only a few students could attend. Some said he was a genius. Others said he was cruel. He was known not only for his breathtaking performances, but also for his sharp tongue. Students who had played for him in other countries said he could crush someone's confidence with a single sentence. Still, everyone wanted to impress him. When the announcement went up on the notice board, Lena stood in front of it for a long time. Her classmates were already talking about what pieces they would play if they got a chance to perform for him. Lena didn't say anything. She wanted to see him, to hear him play, but she wasn't sure she was brave enough to be on that stage. The day of the master class arrived faster than she expected. The concert hall was full. Even students who didn't have class that day came just to watch. Victor Morelli walked in wearing a dark suit, his hair silver and neat, his posture straight and proud. He didn't smile when he entered. He just nodded once and sat at the piano like it belonged to him. The room went quiet. Without a word, he began to play. It wasn't a performance. It was a storm. The notes poured out of him with strength and grace, every chord filled with emotion. No one dared to breathe until he stopped. When he finally did, the silence that followed felt as heavy as the music itself. Then he turned to the students. "Music," he said in a low voice, "is not about hitting the right notes. It's about making people forget the world while you play." He looked around the room, his sharp eyes landing on the students one by one. "Who will play first?" No one moved. Everyone stared at their hands, pretending to look at their sheet music. The air grew tense. Then, before she could stop herself, Lena raised her hand. Her heart jumped. What had she done? Victor's eyes met hers. "You?" he said. "What's your name?" "Lena," she answered softly. "Very well, Lena. Let's hear what you can do." Her classmates turned to look at her, some with surprise, others with pity. Everyone knew she was the quiet girl from the small town, the one who didn't come from money or fame. Lena walked up to the piano, trying to keep her steps steady. Her palms were sweating. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her fingers on the keys. Before she could start, Victor leaned back in his chair and said with a half smile, "Let's hope your playing sounds better than that old piano you practice on at home." Laughter spread across the room. Lena froze. Her face turned red and her fingers stiffened on the keys. She didn't know how he knew she came from a poor background, but his words cut deep. She forced herself to take a deep breath. "Go on," he said, his tone now indifferent. Lena began to play. The first notes came out shaky. Her heart was beating so fast that it was hard to focus. Every sound felt wrong, too soft or too loud. She could hear whispers from the back of the room. She wanted to stop, but she didn't. She kept going until she reached the end. When the final note faded, she looked up, but Victor's face was unreadable. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He just stood up, walked toward her, and said quietly, "You have emotion, but no control. You play like someone who wants to be heard but doesn't believe she deserves it." Then he turned away. Next student. Lena sat there for a moment, her hands still on the keys, her chest tight. The room felt too bright, too heavy. When she finally stood up, she could feel everyone's eyes on her. She walked back to her seat and stared at the floor until the master class ended. That night she couldn't sleep. His words replayed in her mind again and again. You play like someone who doesn't believe she deserves it. At first she felt angry. Who was he to judge her like that? He didn't know how hard she had worked, how much she had sacrificed. But as the anger faded, something else grew inside her. Determination. If he thought she wasn't good enough, she would prove him wrong. The next morning, she went to the practice room earlier than anyone else. She placed her fingers on the keys and started again. She didn't just play. She listened, really listened. Every mistake, every uneven sound. She practiced until her hands ached. She stayed until the janitor came to lock the doors. And she did the same the next day and the one after that. Her roommate noticed the change. "You're obsessed," she said one night when Lena finally came back to the dorm past midnight. "You'll make yourself sick." "I can't stop," Lena said softly. "I have to get better." She didn't tell anyone, but she had picked one of the hardest pieces she could find. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece Victor Morelli was famous for playing. If she could master that, maybe he would see her differently. Maybe he would understand. Weeks turned into months. Her fingers grew stronger, her touch more confident. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine she was on a grand stage, the audience silent, the music rising like a wave. Other times she would hear Victor's voice in her head, cold and distant. "You play like someone who doesn't believe she deserves it." Each time she heard that, she pushed harder. One afternoon, as she practiced, her roommate walked in holding a flyer. "Look at this," she said. It was an announcement for the Academy's annual gala, the biggest event of the year. Only a few students were chosen to perform, and the judges included famous musicians and teachers. And among them, Victor Morelli. Her roommate grinned. "I signed you up." Lena's eyes widened. "What? Why would you do that?" "Because you're ready. You've been living in that practice room for months. It's time people hear you." "I can't," Lena whispered. "He'll be there. He'll remember what happened." "Good," her roommate said. "Then you can show him what he was wrong about." That night, Lena sat by her window and stared out at the city lights. She could hear faint music from other students practicing somewhere in the building. Her heart was heavy with fear and hope. She knew this was her chance, the moment she had been working toward. But it also terrified her. What if she failed again? What if he laughed again? She looked down at her hands, covered in faint marks from endless practice. They were tired, but they were strong. She smiled faintly. "Not this time," she whispered to herself. From that day on, she practiced not for perfection, but for truth. She stopped thinking about impressing anyone. She focused on the sound, the feeling, the story behind every note. Sometimes she played so quietly that tears rolled down her cheeks. Sometimes she played so fiercely that the room seemed to shake. The night before the gala, she stayed in the hall long after everyone had left. She sat in front of the grand piano, her reflection faintly visible on its polished surface. She placed her hand over the keys and said softly, "Tomorrow, I'll show him who I am." Then she closed her eyes and began to play, not for Victor, not for the audience, but for the girl who once practiced on a broken piano in a small-town library, dreaming of this very moment. The morning of the gala arrived cold and cloudy. The city was wrapped in a soft mist that made the academy look like something out of a dream. Lena woke up before sunrise. She couldn't sleep the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard music. Not just notes, but feelings, memories, hopes, and fears all mixed together. Today was the day she would face everything. Her roommate was still asleep when Lena quietly got out of bed and went to the window. The sky was turning pale gray, and the first buses were starting to move through the streets below. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and whispered, "I can do this." At breakfast, she could barely eat. Her stomach felt tight, her throat dry. Other students around her were talking excitedly about the event. Some of them were calm and confident, joking and laughing like it was just another day. Lena sat quietly, trying to slow her heartbeat. She looked at her reflection in her cup of tea and thought about how far she had come, from the small library piano to this grand academy. It almost felt unreal. In the afternoon, the rehearsals began. The hall was alive with energy. Students ran back and forth carrying sheet music, instruments, and costumes. The stage lights were being tested, the chairs arranged neatly for the audience. The smell of polish and wood filled the air. Lena stood at the edge of the stage, watching everything in silence. Her turn for rehearsal was still hours away, but she liked being there. The sound of the piano being tuned reminded her why she loved this so much. When her time came, she walked onto the stage with careful steps. The hall looked huge from up there. The seats stretched far back into the shadows, waiting to be filled. The grand piano shone under the lights like a black mirror. She sat down and took a deep breath. Her fingers touched the keys. They were cold at first, but familiar. She played a few lines to test the sound, and for a moment everything felt right. The rehearsal went well. Her teacher gave her a small nod of approval. "You're ready?" he said softly. Those two words gave her more strength than he could ever know. By evening, the academy was glowing with lights. Cars started arriving one after another, bringing guests, professors, and families. Inside, the atmosphere was full of whispers and excitement. The audience was made up of famous musicians, donors, and critics. Everyone dressed in their best clothes. The students waited backstage, each lost in their own thoughts. Lena's heart was pounding. She could hear the sound of applause and music from the stage as other performers played before her. She tried to focus on her breathing. One of the stage assistants came up to her and whispered, "You're next." Her stomach twisted. Her hands felt cold, but her mind was clear. She remembered the night she had practiced alone, the hours of mistakes and repetition, the tears that had fallen on the keys. All of that had led to this moment. When her name was announced, the audience clapped politely. She walked out slowly, keeping her head high even though her legs felt weak. The hall lights were warm and golden. From where she stood, she could see hundreds of faces, but only one caught her eye: Victor Morelli. He sat in the front row, his posture perfect, his expression calm. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't show any sign of recognition, but she knew he remembered her. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and looked at her hands. The opening of Rachmaninoff's concerto was one she had practiced more times than she could count. It wasn't just music to her anymore. It was her story, her fear, her strength, her heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, took one deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were soft, almost fragile. The sound floated through the hall like a whisper. Slowly the melody grew, stronger, deeper, fuller. Her fingers moved with confidence she didn't know she had. Every chord seemed to carry a piece of her past. The dusty library, the broken piano, the laughter in the master class. But now the laughter didn't hurt anymore. It became part of the music. As the piece continued, the hall grew still. Even the smallest rustle stopped. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. Lena's playing wasn't perfect. A few notes were too strong, others too soft. But there was something real in every sound. It was raw, honest emotion. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just telling her story through the piano. Her heart and the music became one. When she reached the middle section, the melody rose and fell like waves. Her fingers danced across the keys, her face calm but her eyes bright. She didn't see the audience anymore. She didn't even think about Victor. It was just her and the music. Then came the final part, the hardest one. The notes moved faster, demanding precision and power. Her hands flew across the keyboard, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Every sound filled the air like a storm breaking loose. When she hit the final chord, it rang through the hall and faded slowly into silence. For a few seconds, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Lena sat still, her chest rising and falling. Then someone clapped. Another joined. And then the hall erupted into applause. The sound surrounded her, echoing through the space like thunder. People stood cheering, some even shouting her name. She looked out into the sea of faces and saw smiles, surprise, admiration. But what caught her eye most was Victor Morelli. He hadn't moved at first. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he began to clap, once, twice, then more, until he too was standing. The sight made Lena's eyes fill with tears. She didn't know if it was approval or respect, but it didn't matter. For the first time, she felt free. When she left the stage, her hands were still shaking, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from relief, from joy. Backstage, her roommate ran to her and hugged her tightly. "You did it," she said, tears in her eyes. Lena laughed and cried at the same time. "I can't believe it's over," she whispered. Later that night, after the event ended and the hall had emptied, Lena sat alone in one of the back rows. The stage was quiet now. The grand piano stood there, its lid closed. She stared at it and smiled softly. It didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something new. As she sat there lost in thought, she heard footsteps. She turned and saw Victor walking toward her. He stopped a few steps away, hands in his pockets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with silence. Finally, he said, "You played that with something I haven't heard in a long time." Lena looked at him, unsure how to respond. He continued, "Most people play to be admired. You played because you had something to say." She lowered her gaze, her voice soft. "I just wanted the music to speak for me." He nodded slowly. "It did." Then, almost as if talking to himself, he added, "You remind me of how I used to play, and before it all became about perfection." Lena didn't know what to say. His voice was quieter now, without the sharp edge it had before. For the first time, he seemed human, not the cold, untouchable pianist everyone feared. "Keep that fire," he said, turning to leave. "Don't let anyone take it away." And then he walked out, leaving her sitting there in the quiet hall, her heart full and trembling. She didn't need an award or a title. That one sentence was enough. She knew she had changed something, in herself, maybe even in him. When she finally stepped outside, the night air was cool and soft. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and a gentle breeze brushed her face. She smiled to herself as she walked down the empty street, the sound of her shoes echoing lightly. She didn't know where her journey would go next, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had faced her fear, and she had won. Not by fighting, but by playing from the heart. The days after the gala felt like a dream to Lena. Everything had changed so quickly that she could barely catch her breath. Her name was suddenly on everyone's lips. Students who used to ignore her now stopped to congratulate her. Teachers smiled when she passed by in the hallway. Even the janitor who once complimented her in the empty hall gave her a proud nod. It was as if the quiet girl from the small town had finally been seen. Still, Lena didn't let it go to her head. She kept her routine the same. Early mornings, long practice hours, late nights. The difference now was that when she played, people stopped to listen. She was invited to perform at smaller events and local recitals. Each time she played, her confidence grew a little more. But the biggest surprise came a week later when she received an envelope with the Academy seal. Inside was a letter from the board of directors. It congratulated her on her gala performance and invited her to represent the Academy at an international piano competition held in Vienna. Her heart raced as she read the words over and over again. Vienna, the city of music where some of the greatest composers had lived. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. She immediately called her parents. Her mother cried with joy, and her father's voice cracked when he said, "You're really doing it, my girl." It was the first time she had heard that much pride in his tone. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of her life. The competition was only 2 months away, and the level of skill expected was unlike anything she had faced before. She chose to perform the same Rachmaninoff piece that had changed her life, but this time she wanted to bring something new to it. More emotion, more depth. She wanted every note to tell a story. Her teacher arranged extra sessions for her, and she practiced for hours without rest. There were moments when her hands cramped, her eyes burned, and her back ached, but she refused to stop. Sometimes she would look out the window and see other students laughing, going out for dinner, enjoying life. She envied them, but she also knew that her path was different. One evening, as she was finishing her practice, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and froze. Victor Morelli was standing in the doorway, watching quietly. She hadn't seen him since the gala. "Still practicing late, I see," he said, his voice calm. Lena stood up, unsure how to react. "Yes, sir," she said softly. He walked closer, his hands behind his back. "You're going to Vienna," he said, as if it wasn't a question but a statement. She nodded. "I just found out last week." He looked at her for a long moment. "That piece you played," he said. "It wasn't perfect. But it was alive." She didn't know if that was a compliment or a critique, but she smiled politely. "Thank you." Victor tilted his head slightly. "Would you like my help preparing for the competition?" Her eyes widened. "You mean, you would teach me?" "Not teach," he corrected. "Guide. There's a difference." She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'd be honored." From that day on, Victor began working with her twice a week. His lessons were intense and sometimes exhausting. He pushed her harder than anyone ever had. If she played a single note wrong, he stopped her immediately. If her emotion overpowered her control, he made her start again. "Passion without discipline is chaos," he said one day. "And discipline without passion is empty. You need both." There were times she wanted to give up. His words could still sting. His standards were impossibly high, and his silence was often worse than criticism. But deep down, she knew he believed in her. His guidance, though harsh, was helping her grow in ways she couldn't have managed alone. One night, after a particularly long session, Victor sat back in his chair and said quietly, "You remind me of myself when I was young." Lena looked at him curiously. "You?" He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "Yes, I used to play like you for the love of it. But somewhere along the way, I started playing for the audience instead of for the music. Don't make that mistake." She nodded, his words sinking deep into her heart. As the weeks passed, Lena's playing reached new heights. Every phrase, every movement, every pause became more refined. She started to understand what Victor meant. It wasn't about showing off skill. It was about honesty. When she played truthfully, the music spoke for itself. Finally, the day came to leave for Vienna. The academy organized her trip, and her teachers gathered to wish her luck. Her roommate hugged her tightly. "You're going to be amazing," she said. "Remember, it's not about them. It's about you and the piano." Lena smiled, trying to hide her nerves. "I'll remember." The flight to Vienna felt like a dream. She watched the clouds outside the window and thought about everything that had led her here. Her grandmother's lullabies, the dusty library piano, the laughter she once endured. It all felt like pieces of a story finally coming together. When she arrived, she was overwhelmed by the beauty of the city. Every street seemed filled with music. The air was crisp and cool, and the sound of street performers echoed through the plazas. The competition was held in a grand concert hall with golden chandeliers and velvet seats. It was more beautiful than anything she had imagined. During the orientation, she met other competitors, young pianists from all over the world. They were talented, confident, and polished. Some had already won international awards. Lena felt small among them, but she reminded herself that she had earned her place there. The night before her performance, she walked alone through the empty hall. The stage was quiet, the piano covered. She sat in the front row and closed her eyes, listening to the silence. She imagined her grandmother sitting beside her, smiling. "You'll play like you always do," she whispered to the air. "With heart." The next morning, she woke early and dressed carefully. Her hands were steady, but her heart raced. Backstage, she could hear faint echoes of other performances. Some were breathtaking, some mechanical. When her name was finally called, she took a deep breath and stepped into the light. The hall was vast, filled with people from around the world. The judges sat in a long row, their faces serious. In the center of the audience, she spotted a familiar figure, Victor. He had flown there to see her perform. She felt a rush of warmth and pressure all at once. She sat down at the piano. The silence that followed felt endless. Then she began to play. From the first note, she knew something had changed. She wasn't nervous anymore. The sound that came from the piano was alive, full of color and feeling. She wasn't thinking about mistakes or perfection. She was telling her story again, only this time to the world. As the music swelled, she thought of every moment that had led her here. The laughter, the tears, the loneliness, the joy. Each emotion found its place in the melody. The hall was silent except for her playing. She could feel the audience leaning in, holding their breath. When the final note faded, she sat there for a long second, her eyes closed. Then came the applause, strong, sincere, and growing louder by the second. She opened her eyes and saw people standing, clapping, smiling. Victor was among them, his expression calm but proud. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She simply bowed, feeling lighter than she ever had before. After the performance, she walked backstage. Victor was waiting. "You did well," he said quietly. "You didn't play like a student tonight. You played like an artist," Lena smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "Remember this feeling. It's not about applause or awards. It's about knowing you gave your truth to the music." She nodded, his words etching themselves into her heart. As she walked outside into the cool evening air, she felt something she hadn't before, peace. Not just because she had succeeded, but because she had finally become the musician she always dreamed of being. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Lena woke up to the sound of birds outside her hotel window. Sunlight poured through the curtains, filling the room with a soft glow. For a few moments, she just lay there, staring at the ceiling, unsure if the night before had been real. The applause, the standing ovation, Victor's quiet nod, it all felt like a dream. But then she looked at her hands resting on the blanket, the faint ache in her fingers, and she smiled. It was real. She had done it. She got up slowly and walked to the window. The streets of Vienna were already alive with music, street performers, violinists, and distant church bells. She leaned on the window frame and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The competition wasn't over yet. There were still final results to be announced that evening. But in her heart, she already felt she had won something much more important: belief in herself. Downstairs in the hotel dining room, a few other contestants were having breakfast. Some smiled politely when they saw her. Others kept their distance. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, replaying their performances in their minds. Lena took a seat by the window and sipped her coffee. Her hand still trembled slightly, not from fear but from the leftover energy of last night's performance. A few minutes later, someone approached her table. It was Victor. He looked calm as always, dressed neatly, his expression unreadable. She stood up quickly, unsure if she should speak first. "Sit," he said, motioning to the chair across from her. "You played well yesterday." "Thank you," she replied quietly. He studied her for a moment. "How do you feel?" Lena thought for a second. "Tired, but happy." He nodded. "That's good. You should be." He stirred his tea slowly, then added, "You know, I've heard that piece performed by hundreds of pianists. Some were flawless, some were powerful, but very few made me listen." "You did." Her eyes widened slightly. "That means a lot," she said, "especially coming from you." Victor looked out the window, his voice softer now. "When I was your age, I thought perfection was everything. I chased it so hard that I forgot why I started playing. Don't lose sight of the reason you began. It's easy to forget once the world starts watching." Lena didn't know what to say. She could tell his words came from somewhere deep, from years of experience, maybe even regret. After breakfast, she went back to her room and tried to rest, but her mind was too full. She replayed his words again and again. "Don't lose sight of the reason you began." It was strange, but she felt that he wasn't just talking about music. He was talking about life. That evening, the concert hall was packed again. The final results would be announced after the last few performers. Lena sat with the other contestants, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The judges took their seats and the host stepped up to the microphone. The air was thick with anticipation. As the ceremony went on, the names of the top finalists were called. One by one, the winners stood and bowed. Lena listened quietly, her heart pounding. She wasn't expecting anything. She just wanted to hear the results and remember the moment. Then the host smiled and said, "And now the special award for the most emotionally expressive performance goes to Lena." For a moment, she didn't move. It took her a few seconds to realize he had said her name. The audience clapped warmly as she stood, feeling lightheaded. She walked to the stage, her legs trembling slightly. The applause washed over her like a gentle wave. The award wasn't about technique or speed. It was about feeling. And that made it even more special. When she accepted the certificate, she looked out into the crowd and found Victor watching her. He didn't clap loudly or stand, but there was something in his eyes, quiet pride. It was enough. After the ceremony, she walked out into the cool evening air. The city was glowing with lights and the sound of distant music drifted through the streets. She stood on the steps of the hall for a long time, holding her award close to her chest. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about knowing she had found her voice. Victor joined her a few minutes later. He stood beside her silently for a while before speaking. "You played from the heart," he said softly. "That's what makes great music, and not fame, not money. Just truth," she nodded. "I think I finally understand." He smiled faintly. "Good. Because now your real journey begins." They stood in silence again, both lost in their own thoughts. Then Victor said, "I'm returning to Paris tomorrow. But if you ever need guidance, you know where to find me." Lena turned to him and said sincerely, "Thank you for everything. Even for that joke you made months ago." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. That, I suppose I owe you an apology." She smiled. "No, you don't. It pushed me to become better." He gave a small nod. Then perhaps it was worth it. The next morning, Victor left early and Lena spent her last day in Vienna exploring the city. She visited small cafes, old music shops, and quiet corners where local musicians played for passers-by. Every sound felt like a piece of history. She bought a small silver pendant shaped like a piano key, a simple reminder of her journey. When she returned to her hotel, she found a note slipped under her door. It was from Victor. The handwriting was neat, almost formal. It said, "Never play to be admired. Play to be understood. The rest will follow." She smiled as she read it, folded it carefully, and placed it inside her music notebook. A few days later, she flew back home. The academy welcomed her with open arms. There were congratulations, photos, and even a small celebration. But after the excitement faded, she went back to her routine. She didn't want to lose the part of herself that loved playing simply for the joy of it. Months passed, and her name began to appear in small newspapers and online articles. Invitations came from music festivals and schools. She played in different cities, sometimes to hundreds of people, sometimes to just a few. Each performance felt different, but one thing remained the same. She always played from the heart. One evening, she received a letter from a music foundation. They wanted her to lead workshops for children who couldn't afford lessons. She accepted immediately. The first day she walked into the small classroom, she saw a group of kids with bright, curious eyes. Some shy, some loud, all eager to touch the piano keys. She smiled, remembering her younger self in that library years ago. She began teaching them not just how to play, but how to feel the music. "You don't need a perfect piano to make something beautiful," she told them. "You just need to mean it." Watching them play filled her heart in a way no award ever could. She realized that music wasn't just about stages or applause. It was about connection, about giving a part of yourself to others. One afternoon, as she was packing up after class, one of the children asked, "Miss Lena, how did you become so good?" She smiled and thought for a moment. "By not giving up," she said softly, "and by listening, not just to the music, but to life." That night, when she returned home, she sat by her window with her old music notebook. Inside it were worn pages, her grandmother's old notes, and the letter from Victor. She traced the words with her finger and whispered, "I'll keep playing just like you said." Years later, when people asked her about her favorite memory, she never mentioned the awards or the famous performances. Instead, she talked about the night of the gala, the laughter that once embarrassed her, and the moment she found her courage. Because that was where everything truly began. And sometimes when she played on a big stage, she could still hear Victor's voice in her mind. Calm, steady, full of wisdom. Play to be understood, and she always did. Years went by, and Lena's name slowly found its way into the world of classical music. What began as a dream in a quiet library became a life filled with stages, lights, and applause. But even with all the success, she remained humble. She never forgot the small-town girl who once sat at an old piano, playing with more hope than skill. That memory was her anchor. It reminded her of where everything started. She traveled often, performing in different countries. Each place had its own story, its own rhythm. Some concerts were in grand halls with red velvet seats and chandeliers, while others were in small community theaters where the air smelled of wood polish and old memories. No matter where she played, she gave her whole heart to the music. But fame, even in its gentlest form, brings challenges. There were days when the schedule was exhausting. Interviews, rehearsals, late-night flights. Sometimes she found herself missing the quiet moments, the peace she once had while practicing alone. Still, every time she touched the piano keys, she felt grounded again. It was as if the instrument understood her better than anyone else. One winter evening, she received a letter that made her pause. It was from a well-known orchestra inviting her to perform as a soloist for their European tour. The letter was formal, elegant, and respectful, but what caught her attention was the name at the bottom. The conductor's name was Victor Morelli. Her heart skipped a beat. It had been years since she last saw him. She had written to him once after her first teaching year but never received a reply. Now here he was again, reappearing like a familiar melody she thought she'd never hear again. Without hesitation, she accepted the offer. The rehearsals began a month later in Paris. The hall was magnificent with golden walls and high ceilings. When she walked in, the orchestra was already warming up. Musicians tuned their instruments, pages rustled, and the air buzzed with energy. Then she saw him. Victor looked older now, with silver hair and deeper lines on his face, but his posture was still firm, his presence commanding. When he turned and saw her, a faint smile crossed his face. "So," he said quietly when they finally stood face to face. "You came." She nodded, smiling. "You invited me," he chuckled softly. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes." "I couldn't say no," she replied. Their reunion was calm but filled with emotion neither tried to show. Over the next few weeks, they worked together on the performance piece, a powerful concerto that demanded precision and heart. Victor was as demanding as ever, but Lena had changed. She no longer feared his criticism. She understood his standards and shared them. One afternoon, after a long rehearsal, Victor walked over and said, "You've grown. I can see it in the way you play." "It's no longer about proving yourself," Lena smiled. "You taught me that." He looked thoughtful for a moment. "No, you taught yourself. I only pointed the way." Their rehearsals continued, each one better than the last. The orchestra respected her deeply, and Victor's trust in her grew with every note. It felt almost like a full circle, the teacher and the student now equals, standing on the same stage. When the tour began, their first concert was in Berlin. The hall was filled to the brim. Lena walked onto the stage in a simple black gown, feeling the familiar warmth of the lights on her skin. Victor raised his baton and the music began. It was breathtaking. The orchestra's power, her delicate yet strong notes, and the invisible bond between her and Victor. When the final note rang out, the hall erupted in applause. Afterward, in the quiet backstage, Victor said, "You played beautifully tonight. I could feel the truth in every note." Lena smiled, her eyes soft. "I remembered what you told me years ago, to play to be understood." He nodded, his gaze distant. "I'm glad you did." The tour continued across Europe, Rome, Prague, London, and beyond. Everywhere they went, audiences stood to applaud. Reviews called their performances hauntingly human, a dialogue between generations, and a rare emotional masterpiece. But for Lena, none of that mattered as much as the connection she felt through the music. One evening, after a concert in Florence, they sat in a quiet cafe. Victor seemed more relaxed than usual, sipping tea as he looked out the window. The city lights flickered outside like soft stars. "Do you ever miss those early days?" he asked suddenly. "When it was just you and the piano?" Lena smiled. "Every day. That's when I felt closest to the music." He nodded slowly. "Hold on to that. The bigger the stage, the easier it is to lose yourself." She looked at him for a long moment. "You sound like someone who learned that the hard way." He gave a small laugh. "Maybe I did." Then after a pause, he said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Lena. More than you know." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, she saw not the strict teacher or the perfectionist conductor, but a man who cared deeply about the music and the people he mentored. She smiled gently. "That means more than any award." Their tour ended in Paris, the same city where Victor had once lived when she was still a student. On their final night after the last concert, the audience gave them a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. As they bowed together, Victor's eyes glistened under the stage lights. It was a moment that neither of them would forget. After the concert, they walked outside into the chilly night air. Paris was quiet, the streets glowing softly under the lamps. They strolled along the river, talking about music, life, and everything in between. There was a peacefulness between them, the kind that comes when words are no longer needed to express what's felt. Before they parted, Victor said, "Whatever happens next, keep playing with that same heart." "That's your true gift," she nodded. "And you don't stop conducting." He smiled faintly. "We'll see." That was the last time Lena saw him. A few months later, she received a letter from the orchestra. It said that Victor had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The news hit her hard. She sat by her piano for hours, reading the letter over and over. Though she was heartbroken, she also felt an immense gratitude. He had given her so much, not just lessons, but a deeper understanding of music and life itself. That evening, she opened her old notebook again. Between its pages was the note he had once left her. "Never play to be admired. Play to be understood." She traced the words with her fingertips, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Then, she sat at her piano and began to play. The melody was soft, filled with warmth and memory. It was not one of her usual pieces. It was something new, something entirely hers. Every note carried a piece of her journey, her love for music and the lessons she had learned along the way. The song became her tribute to Victor. Later, she performed it publicly for the first time at a charity concert for young musicians. The hall was quiet as she began, and when the final note faded, there was silence before the applause. People didn't just hear the music, they felt it. That night, Lena realized something profound. Music was not just about sound. It was about connection, from one heart to another, across time, across silence. That was the legacy Victor had left her, and it was the legacy she wanted to pass on. Years later, she became one of the most respected pianists and teachers of her time. Her students admired her not just for her skill, but for her kindness and honesty. She often told them, "Perfection is not the goal. Truth is." And sometimes, late at night when the world was quiet, she would sit alone at her piano, close her eyes, and let her fingers move. The music that filled the room was tender, full of life. Somewhere in those notes, she could almost hear a familiar voice, calm, wise, and gentle, whispering, "Play to be understood." And she did. Always.